Corporal Jen Baxter's boots clicked sharply on the cracked pavement of Camas Main Street, a familiar yet distant sound. The late afternoon sun bathed the town in a golden light, but it did little to soften the ache in Jen's chest. After 3 years of service overseas, she was finally home, yet it didn't feel like home anymore. The old hardware store on the corner had a fresh glass facade, its familiar wooden sign hanging askew as if it had been replaced with something wrong. Down the street, the ice cream parlor where she'd spent countless summer afternoons was now a cell phone store. Change was inevitable, but this felt different. This felt like a piece of her was being erased. Jen paused outside the 95 Slide, the bar she'd frequented in her younger years. The neon sign buzzed, barely glowing in the fading daylight, its familiar hum of comfort. Her fingers brushed against the worn leather strap of her pack, the weight of the war still heavy on her shoulders. Her uniform, perfectly pressed, stood in stark contrast to the weathered bar and the downtown's dilapidated charm. The door creaked as Jen stepped inside, the faint scent of stale beer and old wood greeting her like an old friend. The atmosphere was warm, casual. Nothing had changed inside. There were the same dark wooden tables, the polished oak counter, and the same bartender, Hank, behind the bar. He smiled at her, but there was a moment's hesitation in his eyes. She wasn't the same Jen Baxter who used to frequent this place with her friends. The regulars glanced up, but their reactions were mixed. Some nodded with quiet respect, others were more curious, their eyes lingering longer than comfortable. Jen approached the bar, her movements slow but purposeful. She hadn't come back for the familiar faces, but rather for the simple solace of a quiet moment, away from the weight of the world. Hank slid a glass of Coke across the counter. "One for the road, Jen?" he asked, his voice warm. Jen nodded, forcing a smile. "Thanks, Hank." Before she could take a sip, a voice cut through the air, sharp and disdainful. "Hey, soldier girl, didn't know they let murderers in this bar." The words hit like a slap, and Jen's hand tightened around her glass. The group in the corner, young, angry, and full of piercing stares, was the source. The leader, a man with a green mohawk and multiple facial piercings, was glaring at her with a mixture of contempt and challenge. Jen took a deep breath, refusing to let the tension rise in her chest. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, the anticipation thick in the air. "Are you talking to me?" Jen asked, her voice steady but low. The man grinned, stepping closer. "Yeah, I'm talking to you. You military types think you're heroes. But you're just killers in disguise." Jen's pulse quickened, but she kept her calm. Years of military training had taught her to control the storm inside. She wasn't here to fight. She just wanted peace. "I just came in for a drink. I don't want any trouble," she said, hoping to defuse the situation. The guy scoffed, clearly not interested in peace. "Peace?" He laughed bitterly. "You talk about peace after dropping bombs on innocent civilians. You don't deserve peace." The tension escalated. The bartender started to step forward, but the guy with the mohawk shoved him aside. Jen could feel the room holding its breath. She wasn't here to make a scene, but she wasn't about to let this slide either. "I don't want problems," Jen repeated, standing up slowly, keeping her hands visible, a subtle but firm signal she wasn't looking for a fight. "I'll finish my drink and leave. No harm done." But the man wasn't backing down. With a sudden motion, he knocked her glass from the counter, sending it crashing to the floor. The shards scattered, Coke spilling everywhere. The room went silent, save for the sound of glass shattering. "Get out," the man shouted. "We don't want your kind here." Jen's instincts flared, but she forced herself to stay calm. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, some already reaching for their phones to film the confrontation. She was outnumbered, but she wasn't going to back down. Years of military service had taught her how to handle threats, but she wasn't here to prove anything. The bartender shouted that he was calling the police, but the words fell on deaf ears. The young man with the mohawk lunged forward, fist raised, aiming for her face. Time seemed to slow. Jen didn't have time to think. She moved, not with anger but with precision. The punch never reached her with a fluid motion. She deflected his arm, using his own momentum to twist him into a joint lock. The room gasped, and the young man let out a strangled scream of pain. Jen didn't increase the pressure but held him firmly in place. His face turned red with humiliation. "Let go of me," he spat. "I don't want to hurt you," Jen said calmly, her voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through her veins. "But you need to stop this." The bar owner, Hank, stepped in, his big hands raised. Enough. Everybody out. The young group hesitated for a moment. Then one by one they left, throwing hateful glares at Jen as they passed. The man with the mohawk was the last, rubbing his arm and shooting Jen a glare filled with anger and resentment. The room was silent, the weight of the confrontation still hanging in the air. Hank walked over, his face a mix of relief and concern. "Sorry about that," Hank said, shaking his head. "Kids these days, they think they know everything." Jen relaxed her grip, but she didn't speak immediately. Instead, she took a deep breath and glanced around at the other patrons. A few had witnessed the altercation, and their expressions were a mixture of disbelief and admiration. Finally, one of the older men raised his glass toward her, a quiet gesture of respect. "You showed M, Corporal," he said, his voice gruff but sincere. Jen looked around, seeing the shift in the room. They didn't agree with everything she did, but they were beginning to see the person behind the uniform. And for the first time in years, she felt something shift inside her. Maybe this town hadn't completely forgotten what it meant to serve. As Hank set a fresh Coke in front of her, Jen took a sip. The coolness soothed her, but there was something deeper at work, an unspoken understanding. A silent agreement between the soldiers who serve and the civilians they protect. Maybe, just maybe, she could find peace here again. Jen sat at the bar, her back straight, the weight of the room pressing against her. She had done what she had to do, but the confrontation had left her rattled. Not because of the physical altercation that was second nature to her, but because of the words. Murderer. It had stung more than she cared to admit. She had seen war up close. She had seen things no one should have to see: lost friends, lost pieces of herself. But that was the cost of service. It was a sacrifice she had accepted. Yet, those words, those accusations, they still hung in the air. "You all right, Jen?" Hank asked, his voice gentle but concerned. Jen gave him a small smile. "I will be." The truth was, Jen hadn't come back to fight. She hadn't come back to prove anything. She had come back to heal, to find her place again in a town that had once been her refuge. But it seemed that finding peace wasn't going to be as simple as walking through the door. Across the room, an elderly man with a weathered face watched her. He had been silent during the confrontation, but now he approached her slowly, as if waiting for the right moment. "You know," he said, his voice deep and slow, "I was a young man once, fought in Korea. And I remember what it felt like when people didn't understand." Jen turned to him, surprised by his presence. "I didn't know." "Most people don't," he replied with a quiet smile. "But that doesn't mean we don't understand what it takes to serve." Jen nodded, feeling a lump form in her throat. The words weren't grand, but they hit her in a way she hadn't expected. She wasn't alone in this fight. Maybe, just maybe, this town could learn to understand. And maybe she could, too. Jen didn't expect to stand up. But as the room grew quieter, a ripple of respect spreading through the crowd, she felt something inside her stir. The weight of the uniform, of the past, of the silence, it all felt too heavy. She stood, not as a soldier, but as a person. "I didn't come home to fight," she began, her voice cutting through the quiet hum of the room. "I came home to find my place again, to rebuild my life, to be a part of this town like I always was." She paused, her words sinking in, the eyes of the patrons now fixed on her. "We don't serve for glory or pride. We do it because we believe every life matters. When we come back, all we ask for is understanding, not judgment." Her voice wavered slightly, but she pressed on, her resolve hardening with each word. "I've seen war. I've seen what it does to people, and it changes you. But it doesn't take away your humanity. We're all just people trying to make it through. I know some of you don't understand why we do what we do, but it's not black and white. It's not as easy as good guys and bad guys. It's complicated, messy, painful. But we do it because we believe in something bigger than ourselves." The silence in the bar was thick. Jen's chest tightened as she spoke, but she didn't falter. She had to say this, not just for the people here, but for herself. "You might not agree with me," she continued, "and that's okay. But I've served beside men and women who would lay down their lives for their brothers and sisters in arms, and for the people back home. And we ask for one thing in return: understanding. Not hatred, not judgment, just the chance to be human again." The room was still for a long moment. Jen felt the weight of the air heavy with doubt, with hesitation, but also with something else. A quiet respect was starting to grow. A few of the regulars shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure of how to respond. But one man, the older one who had spoken to her earlier, raised his glass. "To those who serve," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. And slowly, others followed suit. Jen watched, her heart pounding, as the room seemed to shift. One by one, the patrons raised their glasses, not in mockery, but in solidarity. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The green mohawked man hadn't returned, nor had the rest of his group. Jen was sure they were still out there, probably fuming in their defeat, but she was done trying to prove herself to them. Instead, she turned back to the bar, took a long sip of her Coke, and for the first time in a long while felt the weight on her shoulders lighten. Jen woke up the next morning to the sounds of birds chirping outside her window, a soft, gentle sound that contrasted sharply with the events of the night before. Her head throbbed slightly from the tension, but it was nothing compared to the quiet peace she felt inside. Last night had been a turning point both for her and for the town of Camas. As she made her way down the stairs, her eyes caught the edge of something glinting on the mantel. It was a small plaque, simple but elegant. "In honor of Corporal Jen Baxter, with gratitude for your service and sacrifice." She reached out and touched it, her fingers running over the words as a lump formed in her throat. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected anything. But the gesture was real, it was genuine. It was a symbol of something more than just her service. It was a recognition of her as a person, of the humanity behind the uniform. Her phone buzzed from the kitchen counter, pulling her away from the plaque. Jen hesitated before answering, the sudden reminder of the world outside her small town tugging at her. She picked it up, glancing at the screen. The number was unfamiliar. "Hello? Jen, it's Hank from the 95 slide. I just wanted to say you were right last night. You didn't just stand up for yourself, you stood up for all of us. You brought something into this town that's been missing for a long time: understanding." Jen paused, absorbing the sincerity in Hank's voice. The same man who had watched her for years with a quiet skepticism was now reaching out with respect. "Thanks, Hank," she said softly. "That means a lot." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line before Hank continued. "Look, I've been thinking. A lot of folks have been coming by today, asking about you. Some of the younger crowd even. They want to talk. You've got people listening now. Maybe it's time for us all to start understanding each other a little better." Jen felt a mix of surprise and cautious hope. She hadn't expected such a quick change, but the sentiment felt real. Perhaps the cracks of division that had plagued her town for so long were beginning to heal, bit by bit. "I'll be there later today," Jen said, the resolve in her voice stronger than she felt. "We can talk." The next few hours passed in a blur. Jen dressed slowly, deliberately, as if the uniform she wore, though no longer an active duty uniform, still carried the weight of duty in her heart. She wasn't just going to a bar, she was walking into a conversation that might help her and her town find some measure of healing. When she arrived at the 95 slide, the atmosphere was different. There was a quiet hum of anticipation in the air, the buzz of hushed conversations and murmurs of curiosity. The group that had clashed with her the night before was absent, but a new energy had entered the room, a sense of cautious hope, of people willing to listen, willing to understand. Jen stepped up to the bar, where Hank greeted her with a nod. "You're not alone today," he said, his voice holding a note of pride. "We've got a few folks here who want to hear what you have to say." Jen's heart raced. She wasn't sure where this conversation would go, but she knew it was an opportunity to speak, to be heard, and more importantly, to help heal the wounds both in her town and within herself. She took a deep breath and turned to face the room, gathering her thoughts. "Thank you for listening," she began, her voice carrying across the space. "Last night I said a lot. I don't expect everyone to agree with everything I've done or the choices I've made. But I hope, from this point on, we can talk. Not just about the things we disagree on, but about the things that matter. We've all got our burdens, our history, and while we can't change the past, we can choose how we move forward." There was silence in the room as Jen spoke, the weight of her words hanging in the air. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't just speaking to defend herself. She was speaking because she wanted to be understood, because she wanted to understand others in return. When she finished, the room was still. Then, one by one, people began to speak up, not in anger or judgment, but with open minds. They asked her questions, not about her uniform, but about her experiences, her fears, her hopes, her humanity. It was a conversation, not a confrontation. Later that afternoon, as Jen stepped outside, she looked up at the fading light of the sky. The town was changing, but more than that, she was changing. The man with the green mohawk, the young activists, the older veterans, they were all parts of something bigger. It wasn't about winning an argument or proving who was right. It was about finding common ground, about stepping forward with empathy instead of fear. Jen had come home to find peace. And while peace wasn't something that could be found in an instant, it was something that was being built, piece by piece. And for the first time in a long time, Jen Baxter felt like she belonged again. So if you love the story, be sure to subscribe, hit the bell, and comment below. Your interaction helps us grow.